All right, we are here to talk about podcasts and the changing world of podcasts. And I think that in that context, specifically discuss women in, and their journey with the podcast and how they have been, how it has been evolving. And I think before we begin on that journey about women in podcast, just little bit context to how they have been for all these years. And so there's a little story or a little sort of couplets. Uh, you know, so for the longest time, we've been told to speak up, but only within the boundaries set by others. You know, be bold, but not too bold. Be heard, but not too loud. Be honest, but not unsettling, right? But then podcasting happened. It's a space now where women are tending to speak, not only just talk, but have actual conversations, but actually have points of view and very emphatically be able to express them without any interruptions, without any permissions, and without the gatekeeping deciding what needs to be said or not said. So I think it's very raw, it's very unfiltered, and it's extremely invigorating to be able to, for women to be able to ride on this journey of podcasts. Some very quick facts about, the background of it. So actually, the first political leader who launched podcasts was George Bush, and that was way back in 2005. At that point of time, it was called an audio blog, right? We were just talking about it as to how the word podcast happened. It was a joint. It's sort of a combination of iPod and broadcast, so it became podcast. So that's how, and it started as an audio thing. And India has the third largest podcast market in the world, and surprisingly, it's being led by women. So that's like the thing. And one interesting thing is that 80% of the podcasts have a listenership which is at least 75%, which is higher than most relationship commitment goals that people have these days. So, yeah, it's not just a trend, it's actually a seismic shift that is happening today. And, with that, let's dive into unpacking this world with these five incredible ladies who have all very rich experiences, how they are breaking barriers, how they're reshaping narratives, and how they are building communities that are really, closed and very well knit. So let's break down this thing with our questions now for the audiences. So my first question is actually to Chetty. And the question is on breaking and gatekeeping barriers, right? So, traditional media, Chetty, has been long a fortress of high walls and mostly built by men. But podcasting it's almost like a, secret back door where you can enter and, you just have a mic and you can own your stage. So, how has this shift changed the game for women journalists and media professionals? And does it challenge the credibility structures of mainstream journalism?
When it comes to credibility structures of mainstream journalism, I'd like to answer that question first. We've seen all over the world, including our recent elections to the US presidential elections that we just saw. A lot of political parties today are turning towards podcasters. They prefer being interviewed by influencers. They are preferring to go to the newer medium, which is the digital medium, as opposed to the age-old television medium, which has appointment viewing of sorts. Even the mainstream media, if you notice, and this is, I'm talking about my 20 years of journalism with mainstream media, eventually the shift that I ended up seeing is whatever we were doing on television had to have snippets, and the highlights of it were being put out on Twitter and on Instagram, because today the Gen Z and the target audience who we are speaking to, which is the youth of the nation, which is the electorate, I'm talking politics here, they are on social media. They are not waiting at 8 p.m. to watch the news or 9:30 p.m. to watch their favorite news anchor like our older generation did. The entire consumption pattern has changed, and a natural result of the consumption pattern changing is podcasts. So I would say podcast is catering to a newer consumption pattern and the proliferation of digital media into each one of our lives, in the lives of the least common denominator. To answer your question about whether the credibility is more or less when it comes to podcasts of mainstream media or new age media, the answer is it depends on the journalist, it depends on the host. There are ample of hosts today who have phenomenal journalistic integrity, and I personally watch their podcasts and consume their content over mainstream media, which we know is governed by advertising, right? Some of them are subscription led, which makes them very democratic, and hence I like to consume that particular content. And sometimes in mainstream media too, you have certain credible journalists. So today, I think people are following journalists more than the network, or more than whether they are on YouTube or whether they are on Instagram. Ravish Kumar, for example, his YouTube channel is doing wonders. We watched him on NDTV when he was a presenter there, but when he moved to YouTube, we're all following him on YouTube. So I think a person in a journalistic credibility led model is working. But having said that, I must say that when we ventured into the luxury and lifestyle space as well, which works very differently in terms of podcasts, even with Hello Magazine, I launched a podcast. We had podcasts with different other magazines that I launched in India as well. The financial construct becomes a bit of a problem. The starting point is very easy because the initial capital expenditure is very low. But after that, how do you sustain? That's a question I'd like to ask everybody out here, because we've launched tons of podcasts and they have not made money like we envisioned. So how do you sustain? That is the bigger question, which is where traditional media takes over, because their money is coming from advertising, and podcast is one small little thing of what they are otherwise doing, which is their bread and butter. So this is a conundrum we need to talk about.
Yeah. No, very interesting. Definitely, I think. And anybody else wants to sort of come into the leading question that we had right now from Chetty?
I think what Chaiti said has a lot of relevance and significance, because you can start a podcast with whatever means you have, but to sustain it, you need somebody to support it, some sort of advertising, some sort of sponsorship, some sort of revenues coming in, which doesn't happen overnight. Leave overnight, which doesn't even happen in a span of 6 months or a year, because it is all dependent on the YouTube algorithms or the algorithm of the platform you're on. So you're actually, to say ruthlessly, you're at the mercy of the platform you're on, right? You may be producing excellent content in terms of meaning, in terms of impact, but does the YouTube promote your content as a podcast?
So
It's
I want to add here, and I'm really glad, Chetty, you asked us to. And sorry, I have a bad throat, but I'll just tell you. So, Chetty, and because of course I've known you for many years, so I see a lot of media houses doing podcasts, and I was anyway going to recommend this to you, Mr. Batra, now that I see you. But what I noticed in Davos, there was a cloud company, and they had a pop-up podcast studio at Davos during the World Economic Forum. In fact, they called me to talk. Like they did a podcast interview with me, and all the data was in cloud. And they had this really picturesque space right where the World Economic Forum, the main congress was. So podcast is also, and we were all talking about it, the format has changed, and I think innovation is the key. And I was just telling all of us when we were discussing, what if there was a podcast, like a pop-up podcast, which was focused, because this becomes a panel discussion, but you're getting great content. But at an event like this, and I was, that I was at India Today Conclave yesterday, and I did see some of the people taking bites. Bites are different, sound bites for Instagram and LinkedIn, but if you had a dedicated, you'll be able to use that same content, and if we can innovate in an interesting manner. Of course, I'm not the right person to answer your marketing and the business and the financial part of it, but I'm just talking from an innovation point of view, because that's how the Gen Zs are consuming the content. And some of those which I have seen by Nikhil Kamath, his podcast, or Jay Shetty, they were really interesting. Like the Nikhil Kamath one, which he did on something on crafting of beers. It was more like a panel discussion format on a dining table, yes, which was interesting visually, and the conversation. I just saw this morning, and as you all know, Women Inspiring Network has just launched its podcast 3 days back, Win Voices. But I just saw Masoom Meenawala, who is a great content creator. She just did something with Shireen Bhan. Shireen is a media person who has her own podcast, and we all know who Shireen is. But like, I just sent the link to my team, and we just did a story on that. And I said, that's great content. Like, it's a great podcast. I actually went onto the YouTube to see it. So, how you present, how you innovate, how you connect with the audience, because your audience is all Gen Zs and social. So, that is where I feel the adaptability is important. And maybe the business part you can answer, ma'am.
Yeah, that's the most critical
that's what
part.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking.
I asked that question first. Then we can
A bit later. So, Gauri, carry on.
Okay.
Yeah, I think these ladies, because they were picking my brain earlier about when I started the podcast, okay. I think that the key question is, are you doing the podcast because you want to have a voice? Or are you doing a podcast because it's a business venture for you? Right? The two are very different, right? The moment you want to do a podcast because you want to have a voice, then all you're investing into it is time, right? And then, audiences will find you as and when they need you. Even if a few hundred listen to it, but you're making an impact, you'll be happy, right? And that was probably the purpose with which I started. So we've spent $0 on marketing my podcast. Okay, it's an only audio podcast, and we've got millions of right listeners, which is college-going students and early professionals, because that's a target audience that we were talking to. I was interviewing CEOs. I was finding out, how to be successful in the corporate world. Entrepreneurs may not have heard it. Journalists may not have heard it. Housewives may not have heard it, right? But who's your target audience? And I did it to find a voice. As a brand marketer, we evaluate all the time successful podcasts in which we can invest money, right? In which we can sponsor, or in which we can do placement of people or placement of products, right? Now that mechanics is very different. The KPI there is almost like launching a new brand, And then the inconsistent thing that has happened on account of the recent episodes is, do you want, how do you ensure that there is sustainability, not just of your content, but the key person who's doing the content, right? But it's a business. The platforms actually have made it possible. So I don't blame the platforms. I love them. Okay, I think the algos that they have, whether it's on Instagram or on LinkedIn, the focus in Spotify has been, now looking at it in embedding video podcasts, right? Apple still does, the audio ones, right? So there is a mix. Video podcast is what is the popular way of doing podcasts today. And some of the people who I know who've just started new podcasts because they want to do it as a business venture, it is absolutely like how we launch a new brand. Who's your TG? What's the content niche? What are your next 50 episodes going to look like? Okay, will people want to listen to it? Right? What is the niche in terms of what's already available in the market? Have you done that research? Are you going to be presenting something new? And then the most important question, what time you're investing into it? What is the value of that time that you want out of this podcast? And therefore, how are you going to cost it, and where you're going to get the sponsorship from? Or what is your methodology? You could always, one idea that hasn't been done is a not-for-profit podcast, right? Which is fantastic. What I like Nitin Kamat's podcast, not so much for the fact that he's actually invested quite a bit of money in getting his production out, but what I loved about, I was seeing his and Kiran Majumdar's podcast the other day, that they both at the end of the podcast committed 50 lakhs, because they can afford to, into an NGO or into a service of their choice. So they're also doing do good, in that sense. Not all his episodes are great, some are great. But he's enjoying, doing it. But look at Jay Shetty, whose name, we took earlier. Jay Shetty, I don't know whether he started with a business plan or not, but clearly his whole business depends on it. He's a motivational speaker. That's how he kind of makes money. So the podcast is an addendum, to what he does. So yeah, different strokes for different folks. But what's your objective?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the big takeaway from here is that credibility, of course, is there. I believe because of the medium and the way that people are talking about it. They obviously pick up a subject which is close to their heart, and they obviously feel about it, and hence authenticity comes out, and that leads to credibility. So I think credibility itself is lent to the medium, but depends on how you take it forward and how much you've thought about it, how you plan it. All of that brings in the other business aspect of it. However, I don't think so that this medium can be considered as a separate medium on its own. It's one of the things in the larger scope of what is available to communicate this thing, which actually was going to bring me to the next question to you only, Dipali, which is that you're a brand leader and you understand the fine balance between being safe and between being authentic, right? And as a brand leader, you do understand the cancel culture that we have, and the fact that we are constantly under this digital scrutiny. So how do you do the balancing between authentically communicating the brand values but also being safe, especially now?
I'll just comment on three things that brands are doing. One is a lot of the brands are attempting to start their own podcasts. Okay, I have seen podcasts from condom brands to technology brands, right? So all of them are trying to start their own podcast. So one is what is that? How successful they will be at it is a function of how well they do the content, who does the content, what kind of content they work at it, and how they do the integration of the brand. Sometimes you can start a podcast, but you don't do a great integration of the brand. So that's one model, right? The second model is there are existing podcast opportunities or digital marketing properties or influencers, let me club them together, who are now available, what I call for sale, for me to put my product there, for me to put my launch there, for me to put my spokesperson there, right? Now, there is a very methodical evaluation of exactly the way you decided which celebrity I'm going to put in my advertisement, right? And what is the longevity of it, and what's the brand authenticity match to that person recommending your brand. And some CMOs will get it right and some CMOs will get it wrong, but I think there is a very methodical way of doing it, and at what cost it's available. It has to make sense at the cost it's available. The challenge that you are as a marketer facing there is that in the digital world, there is a huge pressure on calculating ROI on every marketing dollar spent. But when it comes to the world of influencers and podcasts, it's extremely difficult to understand what has been the impact in measured numbers, right?
How authentic it is.
And how authentic it is. So there is governance, there are those discussions that are happening around it, and the world over there is, evolving, right? So I said, three things that I want to talk about. The third is not all podcasters or digital influencers and what they offer is the same. And it's not a very organized industry, so it is very difficult for the brands to reach the right, influencer or podcasting medium, properly. And yes, you spoke about some of the famous journalists or good media houses having podcasts on their own. I think they're doing a good job of going to the brands, whereas the single influencer, single podcaster probably requires a platform.
But I think Dipali,
I'd just like to add to that. When she spoke about the good journalists who have started doing podcasts, I see a tectonic shift in the content of what is being spoken about on their podcast versus what they're saying on mainstream media as well. If you notice on mainstream media, they're a little reticent about saying a couple of things which they can otherwise not say, right? And that podcast is a good enabler for them to go all out and say what they really want to say. Probably if more governance kicks in, I don't know where we stand with that, but at this point of time, I see a lot of journalists doing some fantastic work on podcasts, and the same journalists, when they're hosting shows on television channels, I don't know where that fantastic content goes away.
And I just want to add, I've been on national television for 18 years as an anchor. I've hosted thousands of shows, and now I do a podcast. So I can say from experience that what is the difference? Yes, of course, there are agendas, though we've never had. I was fortunate in that way. But yes, when you're doing a podcast as an influencer, as a content creator, you have lots of liberty. You know what to say, and if you are a journalist, if you have a journalistic background, then you are all the more conscious of what is right, what is wrong. It depends on where you're headed, what is your target, and how do you want to approach the subject you're talking about. So definitely podcast gives you much greater leverage, space, but also its responsibility. I mean, as a journalist, I can say, yes, whatever you speak has a lot of weight. So you should weigh it, not just for the sake of saying it, you say it, because you are free and there's nobody controlling you. But yes, I think podcast in that ways is different from TV, has a lot of more potential and gives you a wider space.
And
Also
I,
empowerment, right?
so,
Yeah.
so I wanted to just add, Chaiti, and when you first answered, you said how podcast is a means of influencing, and also some of these journalists which we talked about who have great podcasts are also building their own. So it's also great because one of your questions is like how it's game changers for women in general. So you're creating your own brand. So when you've gone onto the Instagram and you've gone onto the LinkedIn Top Voice or YouTuber, this is a natural shift. I mean, that's for 6 months, I actually sat on for even Win to create the own podcast. But everybody's like, it's a natural shift. We have to go with the wave. If it's like if you want to be in the media space, like you have to be a part of the social media. So that is something which
And because it's Women's Day, I might add that it is extremely empowering for us to all get a voice. Today, all that you require is a mic and a regular smartphone, anyone that you're using. Just plug it on and say what you want to say. Use the power of Instagram, use the power of YouTube, use the power of all the mediums that are out there. And if, like Dipali said, if your motive is not to make money through the podcast, because when you're talking about money, it's a very different story, because you have to look at a brand, you have to look at the ROIs, you have to look at the money coming in, what they are benefiting. Are you telling the story of the brand correctly in terms of brand communication? But when you are doing it just to have a voice, it is one of the most empowering mediums that there is today for each one of us women to have a voice which is autonomous, independent, without anybody telling you what not to say. And I'd like to know from you, Amita, as well, in terms of sport, what happens?
Yeah, but just give me 1 second. I just want to push the boundaries a little bit out here before we move on to the next thing. And the boundary I want to push is, the question really is that it feels really amazing to have a voice and to be heard because we have a mic and you have a smartphone, and that's what it just takes for you to start off. But the question is, do you really, what's the balance between being safe and between being authentic, right? Because we found the voice doesn't mean that you go out and say everything. So where do you draw the lines? Because there is a lot that needs to be said, and I think we are all wanting to kind of, get it out, and that bubbliness that comes in.
Yeah, so that's something that I wanted to talk about. Shoma spoke in the morning and she spoke about mobocracy, the fact that everybody has, a hand on the mic and you could be broadcasting whatever you like, which means you're really catering to the lowest common denominator. For me, I think what it also translates to is that as consumers, you actually no longer have someone, you used to have traditional gatekeepers. Media was a traditional gatekeeper. It also meant that the assault on your senses was saved. Now it is a free-for-all. It's to each his own. You have to protect your own senses at everything is being thrown in your direction. So I would like to say that while the traditional gatekeepers have been broken, but there is a new gatekeeper that has come in, which is the algorithm. And I think what your question is referring to, and what everyone's kind of straddling with is, on one side is your why, where you're trying to define the purpose with which you started or the goal that you're trying to achieve with your podcast. And on the other side are, the compulsions that the algorithm puts on you, which pushes you to kind of show your narrative in the way. Just an example of that is 30-second reels is by, the format by which the algorithm will incentivize what you put out there. Yeah, so if you try to put a 3 minutes stuff, it'll actually kind of warn you to say that I'm not going to distribute it to more people. I'm not going to recommend it to more people. So if you're someone who's trying to put out content for context and for nuance, because in 30 seconds, sometimes you can't build that context and nuance, that's a line that you're always straddling. That are you going to be on the side of context, nuance, or are you going to look for more distribution? I would say that there are no easy answers to it. It is a line to be
I'm
straddled.
going to push you again on that one, right? Because it's very important for us to get this context right and bring it out. We have a audience full of people who are wanting to learn from the experiences of all of you. Again, let me push the boundary. Would you leave the playing, if it's a choice between playing safe versus being authentic, would you let being safe left to the algorithm, or would you have your own set of boundaries which you will build inside as well?
So I would say, one of my favorite podcasters spoke about a book called Wanting, which talks about mimetic desire. That all of us, what we desire out there is what we see in our environment, whatever we are looking at. And in the environment out there on Instagram, you know, what you see is you feel there are these very successful influencers. There's now apparently classes of them, the M class and the K class of influencers, and the K ones are always trying to aspire to the other one. The only way to kind of tackle, I think, the mimetic desire and not go completely, you know, awry is have your sense of values where you define a framework for yourself to say that this is
Wonderful.
This is
I
what
think self-censorship is what
Yes,
she's talking about, and
wonderful.
self-censorship extends when we are finding ourselves in a social situation, or even when I'm sitting here with a mic in my hand. What am I saying? It is self-censorship, right? I'm not going to just get up and say whatever I want to. So as professional podcasters, you know what the limitations are, what the law of the land is, how much I can say, how much I can't say. Doesn't mean I can't express my opinion. But again, coming back to what Dipali just mentioned, are you there to have a voice? Are you there to build your own, make it a business model? If you're there to have a voice, have self-censorship and speak on facts, most journalists who are trained through mainstream media will stick to self-censorship and will present facts. But if you are trying to build a business model like Dipali said, the entire construct is very different. You are telling a brand story. Please understand, you are trying to say this for a brand to tell a narrative and the story of what the brand stands for, which is very, very different than having a voice. So we must all assess before starting a podcast, why are we doing this in the first place?
Should we?
It's the same. It's the same. In a podcasting format, you can do an interview. You can do an interview like she's interviewing us right now, or you could do it on a camera with your headphones on, or you do it without you being seen on radio, like the traditional radio format, or do it as a podcast where you listen in to the podcast as well. It's actually the same.
No, I
Like a
meant
journalist is, yeah.
video interview versus.
It's the same.
So
Yeah,
the only
yeah.
thing, the only thing is that there are models where the podcast is one-on-one and is not getting interviewed. So that model also exists, but it's like self-interview. But I think the more popular use of the term is being used for the interview podcast.
Correct, correct. And it's also about the branding part of it, right? So if I'm branding myself, like I ran something called as the Click on Hello Magazine. The Click became a podcast, but everything else that we did on the Hello Magazine or any other platform, the magazines that we launched, that was not called a podcast because that was a normal bite, an interview that we were taking. So
Yeah. Okay, which actually brings me to you, Amita, on the next question, which is, I mean, because you handle more niche, podcasts, and you're in the space where the more mainstream ones, still tend to get monetized, still tend to get talked about and broadcast, and they are, by virtue of the fact that they're more mainstream, they'll be more popular and be able to. But how do you look at niche conversations and podcasts that happen, and really about turning a passion project into something which is something that you could make more popular out of? That's one question. And how do you make brands, if at all, associate and pay up? So just talk a little bit about that, and what should be some smart monetization strategies. So, for example, do you think there should be a measurement in place, or and also please maybe talk a little bit about what women should absolutely not do in order for all this to happen, or
So I think Shan has asked lots of questions together. I think the buzzer is going, so I'm going to try and quickly answer this. So one is, I would say, when it comes to, I think you mentioned it, Dipali, it's very easy to start. There are no barriers, but the difficult part comes when you have to scale it. And I think the first thing the myth you need to break is the illusion of free marketing, or there is nothing free. When you're trying to create content and assuming you don't even have a big team or a studio that you're hiring, even if you're doing straight out of your home, there are costs for tools, subscriptions that you need to pay for. So as a podcaster, if you're looking at creating one, you need to know that you've got to invest. Some of the examples we spoke about, Jay Shetty used to advertise prolifically. I mean, I remember his ads would keep running. So is Ankur Warikoo, who's quoted as a big example, but these are all people who front-loaded a lot of money right in the beginning to build. So one I would say is that it takes like fair amount of investment on your side. monetization is I think we all spoke. It's not an easy one to crack, but I would say that there are smart routes that you can say apart from reaching out to brands or the advertisers. It's also leveraging your own community. So I think a lot of podcasters or content creators are also trying to do, for example, live ticketed events, workshops, through which they could be monetizing the community to an extent, and even with brands, I would say that you'll have to actually go out and tell your story. Brands are also becoming smarter. There is research now coming in which talks about it isn't always the macro creators who are delivering the most ROI. It's actually, and this is true especially in the rural centers, where the micro influencers, which is people, let's say between 10 to 50,000 followers, would be delivering far greater value. And the reason is that it's not about followers. It is the kind of engagement that you're able to draw. So I think it then becomes about creating value for your consumer, people you're following, and hence also creating value for brands. I think when you're beginning, you should start kind of thinking about what are the kind of brands which will align with the kind of work that you're trying to do.
I think that's wonderful. Great insights out here. We have to really end the session, but I just want to maybe ask one last
I think
thing
one
to-
thing I'd like to add
especially
here.
to you,
Yeah,
Richa.
yeah.
I wanted to ask you
Yeah.
one question. If there was one key takeaway that you had to give in women podcasters, and there was one myth that you wanted to break, what would that be about podcasting?
See, you said women are in big numbers in podcasting, but somehow I take it with a pinch of salt. I don't see that very often, to be honest. And I look at it from the other spectrum. Yesterday we celebrated Women's Day, and you would be surprised to know that 89 million Indian urban women are out of the job market. They're well educated. They can do jobs, but they're out of the job market. This says a lot about why Indian women are not working. Forget the podcasting or speaking up. They're not able to work for a variety of reasons. So I would like to see a lot of women speak up and take ownership, but podcasting, to be very honest, to put it ruthlessly, is more like about entrepreneurship. You won't do it for a kind of public service. Even if you started with that notion, after some time you may be demotivated to give it up. What is it giving me? I'm investing my time, I'm investing my energy. My time is money. And a podcast is like, bringing up a baby. Right? So you have to put in your money, your time, your energy, your contacts, and your personal branding. It's, again, a very great medium to build your own personal brand if you're serious about it. So I think women out there who think that podcasting is something that they can do, then they should actually look at it from a serious angle. Because you do it for some time and sometimes later you feel that it's not sustainable. I'm not able to put in the money. I'm not able to put in the energy. It's not giving me anything. Because forget 6 months. It may not even pay up for another 1 year. It's all algorithm dependent. And one myth that I want to break that you said is that it's easy to do. It may be easy to start with, but it's not easy to continue doing it on your own without any monetization, revenues, and advertising. So think before. I would encourage more women to speak up, take ownership, build their own personal brand, but this is serious business.
I think that just is the perfect segue into asking just the last question. And I want to ask this more from a perspective that, we talked about the fact that it's easy to begin, but it's not easy to sustain. And there's a lot that you have to think about before you actually get into the whole podcast. If you want to look at it like a business and you want to sort of look at it from a scaling point of view. And to that effect, Stuti, do you have something to add on collaboration and on networks and on, women recommending women, that kind of conversation that, is there anything you would like to add as an insight there?
Yeah, so actually, the Women Inspiring Network started more as a community during the pandemic. And only last year, we sort of, to scale it up, we decided to make it into a non-for-profit. But we've actually thrived on collaborations. And which is the point which I wanted to bring about, because when we started last year, when we were doing our panel discussions at Davos, we did it with CII, Invest India, and a UK-based organization. In New York, we did it with different organizations and so on and so forth. So even this year, we did our own event but we also collaborated with the government and some of the other organizations. So, and collaboration is something which we all have to sort of look forward. So when I cited the example of Masoom Meenawala and Shireen Bhan doing the podcast, both of them being podcasters, but talking to each other. And for our own lineup of podcasts, like we are speaking to people who are women podcasters. Like how can we all sit and collaborate? So when I was speaking to you, Mr. Batra, like if you had like a pop-up podcast studio. So that's a collaboration. It doesn't need to be everything an individual entity does not need to do, but how do you collaborate? And that is where innovation and I think the working model will come across. And I think that will not add to the financial burden on one entity as such or an individual as such.
So there's clearly, yeah.
When she spoke about collaboration, it's very important then to establish yourself in terms of who you are. Establish yourself in your professional network. Only once you are established, then you will be able to have those kind of collaborations in place as well. Also, marketing 101, who you're talking to becomes very, very important. If the target audience that you're talking to is resonating with a certain brand, who can be your potential advertiser, you have one. But if your target audience is extremely fragmented, that one day you speak about apples and the other day you're talking about, I don't know, hydrogen, then it doesn't work out, right? So one has to be very, very careful about who your target audience is, and to be able to get the collaboration, first be somebody who's a voice in that space already. And mind you, as much as this is an unpopular opinion, mainstream media is a huge enabler, because we're all coming from a transference of the mainstream media into the new age. So most, outside of a few podcasters who have made it on their own only through digital medium, the ones that we follow, it, especially for politics today, they're the ones who have already been established in the mainstream media, and hence you're listening to them on a podcast to begin with.
So great points there. I think there's a lot of learning that we've had. Have a voice, have a passion, look at it like a long term, invest in it, think about the future, look at collaborations. Brands do like the fact that podcasts add a lot of authenticity and value, and it does build loyalty over the other kinds of media and digital that is available. I think there is a lot more that can be discussed, but let's give it a hand for all these incredible 5 ladies.
Just the last one about also challenging your assumptions, because sometimes we enter things with certain assumptions. I mean, I run a sporting podcast for young athletes, beginner and intermediate, and sports parents. And often I may think some of the content is actually for urban centers, and I only realize that some of this is actually more, there is more demand or there is more need for this, which is coming from the rural ones. And on a lighter note, I went to the salon in the morning and I asked that guy, "Bhaiya, aaj to Sunday hai, khoob log aayenge." He says, "Nahi ma'am, aaj to match hai, तो कोई नहीं आएगा." I said, अच्छा, women also. He's like, what are you talking about? हमारे एरिया में औरतें बहुत दिल लगा के मैच देखती हैं, तो सैलून बिल्कुल खाली होता है. It's always about challenging our assumptions.
Nice.
I'm missing my match as well, and I'm raring to go back to home and watch the match. But she spoke about the rural areas and tier 2, tier 3. I think there is where the opportunity is quite big in terms of podcasts. In terms of variety, in terms of diversity, in terms of ethnicity, languages, culture, geographies, what India has, I think none of the countries have. So if you look at from that perspective, a lot can be done in terms of podcasts in regional languages, and a lot of potential in tier 2, tier 3 cities is what I like to conclude with.
And you know, I mean, I'm missing my salon today. I had to go.